The date is November 16, 1965. Landing Zone X-ray, Ia Drang Valley, Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore stands alone in a clearing. Around him, the ground is scorched black from napalm strikes. Shell craters dot the landscape. Hundreds of North Vietnamese army bodies lie in the elephant grass where they fell during 3 days of fighting. Moore is waiting for a helicopter, not to evacuate himself, to evacuate the last of his dead. His battalion has been fighting for 54 hours. The perimeter has held. The North Vietnamese have withdrawn. The battle is over. Every living soldier from 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry has been lifted out. The wounded have been medevaced. The survivors have been extracted. What remains are the bodies. American soldiers killed in action. 79 men who will not be going home alive. Moore has spent the last 6 hours supervising the recovery of every single one. They have been placed in body bags, loaded onto helicopters, flown to Pleiku. There is one helicopter left. It is landing now. Moore watches it settle onto the dirt. The crew chief is waving at him. The helicopter is empty except for the crew. It is here for Moore. He is the last American on Landing Zone X-ray. Moore walks to the helicopter. He climbs aboard. The aircraft lifts off. As it gains altitude, Moore looks down at the clearing. He has kept his promise. Every man accounted for. No one left behind. This is not a story about a battle. It is a forensic examination of what happens when a commander makes an unconditional promise to his soldiers and then spends 3 days of hell proving that the promise was not rhetoric. It is the story of how Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore told his battalion before they deployed to Vietnam that he would be the first man on the ground and the last man out, and that he would leave no man behind. And it is the story of why that promise mattered when his battalion was surrounded, outnumbered 5 to 1, and fighting for survival in a jungle clearing 20 miles from the nearest American support. To understand why Moore's promise mattered, you need to understand what he was promising to prevent. Because in war, men get left behind. It happens, and when it happens, it destroys the survivors. Part 1. The promise that bound a battalion. Let's be precise about what Hal Moore promised his soldiers before they deployed to Vietnam. Because the promise was not vague, it was not conditional, it was absolute, and it was made publicly in front of the entire battalion. The date was July 1965, Fort Benning, Georgia. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. The battalion was preparing to deploy to Vietnam. Moore had been their commander for nearly a year. He had trained them, drilled them, pushed them through the experimental air assault doctrine that the army was betting would change the nature of infantry warfare. Moore assembled the battalion in formation. He stood in front of approximately 450 soldiers, officers, non-commissioned officers, enlisted men. He looked at them, and he made 3 statements that would define his command for the rest of his life. Statement 1. When we go into combat, I will be the first man to set foot on the battlefield, and I will be the last man to leave. Statement 2. We will leave no man behind, dead or alive. We will bring every soldier home. Statement 3. I cannot promise that all of you will come home, but I promise that if you do not come home, I will bring you home. These were not motivational slogans. They were binding commitments. Moore was establishing a contract. He was telling his soldiers that he would share their risk, that he would not ask them to do anything he would not do first, and that if they died under his command, he would personally ensure that their bodies were recovered and returned to their families. The institutional context matters here. In 1965, the United States military was transitioning from the large-scale conventional warfare of World War II and Korea to the small-unit counterinsurgency warfare of Vietnam. The command culture was changing. Helicopter mobility meant that commanders could position themselves anywhere on the battlefield. Many battalion and brigade commanders were choosing to command from helicopters circling above the fight. Moore rejected this approach. He believed that command required physical presence at the point of greatest danger. He believed that soldiers would fight harder for a commander who shared their risk than for a commander who directed them from the sky. And he believed that the promise to leave no man behind was not just a moral obligation, it was a tactical necessity. Here is why the promise mattered tactically. Soldiers who believe they will be left behind if they are wounded or killed fight differently than soldiers who believe they will be recovered. A soldier who thinks he might die alone in the jungle has an incentive to avoid risk, to stay in cover, to let someone else take the dangerous assignment. A soldier who knows his commander will come for him has an incentive to take risks that benefit the unit because he trusts that the unit will protect him if things go wrong. Moore understood this calculus. He was not making the promise because he was sentimental. He was making it because it gave his battalion a tactical advantage. Soldiers who trust their commander fight harder. Units with high trust have better cohesion. Better cohesion means better combat effectiveness. But promises are easy to make in a parade ground in Georgia. They are harder to keep in a jungle in Vietnam when the enemy is trying to kill everyone and the helicopters cannot land because of enemy fire. Moore's promise would be tested within 4 months of arriving in country, and the test would determine whether his soldiers had been right to believe him. Part 2. The Geometry of Disaster. The Battle of Ia Drang began on November 14, 1965. Moore's battalion was ordered to air assault into a remote valley in the Central Highlands and search for North Vietnamese forces that had attacked a Special Forces camp at Plei Me. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Instead of finding a retreating enemy force, Moore inserted his battalion directly on top of an NVA staging area. Over 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers were camped at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, preparing for their own offensive operations. Moore had 450 men. The enemy had 5 times that number. The fighting started within 2 hours of the first helicopter landing. By nightfall on November 14th, Moore's battalion was completely surrounded. The perimeter was under continuous attack. Soldiers were fighting at ranges close enough to throw grenades. The North Vietnamese were trying to overrun individual positions and collapse the American line. Moore's command post was in the center of the perimeter. He was coordinating artillery fire, calling in airstrikes, directing the movement of his reserve platoons to plug gaps in the line. He was also tracking casualties, 79 killed in action by the time the battle ended, 121 wounded. But the most critical problem was not the casualties inside the perimeter. It was the casualties outside the perimeter. 2nd Lieutenant Henry Herrick's platoon had pushed forward from the main line during the initial contact. They had pursued retreating North Vietnamese soldiers into a grove of trees. The NVA had counterattacked. Herrick's platoon was cut off, surrounded, isolated from the battalion. Herrick was killed in the first minutes of the fight. Platoon Sergeant Ernie Savage took command. 29 men, 400 meters from the main perimeter, completely surrounded by an estimated 200 to 300 North Vietnamese soldiers. This was the test of Moore's promise. He had 29 men cut off in enemy-controlled terrain. Every attempt to reach them would cost casualties. The tactically prudent decision would be to wait for reinforcements, to consolidate the main perimeter, to accept that Herrick's platoon was lost and focus on saving the rest of the battalion. Moore did not make that decision. He had promised that no man would be left behind. Herrick's platoon was behind enemy lines, but they were not being left. Moore was coming for them. The only question was how. Part 3. The Calculus of Rescue. Here is what a rescue attempt looked like at Landing Zone X-Ray on November 14th and 15th. The numbers are specific. The geometry is brutal. The cost was measured in bodies. The distance from Moore's command post to the cut-off platoon was approximately 400 meters. The terrain in between was elephant grass and scattered trees. The North Vietnamese controlled that terrain. They had positioned machine guns and snipers to cover the approaches. Any American force attempting to reach the cut-off platoon would be moving through a kill zone. Moore ordered the first rescue attempt at approximately 3 p.m. on November 14th. Alpha Company, commanded by Captain Tony Nadal, attempted to push through to the cut-off platoon. They made it 100 meters before taking casualties from multiple directions. The advance stalled. Nadal pulled his men back. Moore ordered a second attempt at 5 p.m. Bravo Company tried a different route. They were hit by machine gun fire before they could close half the distance. More casualties. The attempt failed. Night fell. Moore could hear the cut-off platoon calling for artillery support on the radio. They were calling fire within meters of their position. North Vietnamese soldiers were probing their perimeter. The platoon was running low on ammunition. Moore sent a resupply helicopter to attempt a night drop. The helicopter took heavy fire and had to abort. The cut-off platoon spent the night of November 14th surrounded. No food, no water. Wounded men lying in the foxholes with the unwounded because there was no room to move them. dead soldiers being used as sandbags because there was no safe place to lay them out. Sergeant Savage kept his men alive by maintaining fire discipline. Every round had to count. No wasted ammunition. The platoon was rationing grenades. Soldiers were fixing bayonets because they expected hand-to-hand fighting if the North Vietnamese overran their position. Moore spent that night planning the next rescue attempt. He knew his men were dying in that isolated perimeter. He knew every hour they remained cut off reduced their chances of survival. But he also knew that a failed rescue attempt would cost more lives and would not save the cut-off platoon. The tactical problem was firepower. Moore needed to suppress the North Vietnamese positions between the main perimeter and the cut-off platoon long enough for a rescue force to move through. He needed artillery, he needed airstrikes, and he needed them coordinated precisely so that the rescue force could advance under the cover of the explosions. At dawn on November 15th, Moore coordinated a massive fire support plan. Artillery batteries at Landing Zone Falcon fired preparatory fires on the suspected North Vietnamese positions. Air Force fighters dropped napalm and high-explosive bombs. B-52 bombers hit the Chupong Massif where the NVA regiment was staging. Under the cover of this fire, Moore personally led a relief force toward the cut-off platoon. Not from his command post, not from a helicopter. He walked point with the lead elements. If his men were going to die trying to reach the cut-off platoon, he was going to die with them. The relief force advanced through the kill zone. They took casualties. Soldiers fell wounded. The medics worked under fire. But the volume of supporting fire was suppressing the North Vietnamese positions long enough for the Americans to move. At approximately 10:30 a.m. on November 15th, the relief force reached the cut-off platoon, 30 hours after they had been surrounded. Of the 29 men in the platoon, 9 were dead, 13 were wounded. The survivors were out of food and nearly out of ammunition. Sergeant Savage's first words when Moore reached the perimeter were that they knew someone would come for them. They had not doubted. Moore had promised no man would be left behind. They had believed the promise, and the promise had kept them fighting. Part 4. The accounting. The rescue of the cut-off platoon did not end the battle. The fighting continued through November 15th and into November 16th, but it established the pattern that would define Moore's command at X-Ray. Every soldier mattered, every casualty would be accounted for. No one would be left in the jungle. This accounting was not metaphorical. Moore was literally counting bodies. He maintained a roster of every soldier in his battalion. As casualties occurred, the names were checked off. Killed in action, wounded in action, missing. Every category had to be resolved before Moore would consider the mission complete. The missing category was the most critical. In the chaos of combat, soldiers can be separated from their units. They can be wounded and unable to move. They can be taken prisoner, or they can be dead and their bodies are in a location that has not been searched. Missing means uncertainty, and uncertainty is unacceptable. Moore refused to accept uncertainty. If a soldier was listed as missing, search parties went out. If a body was seen in an area controlled by the enemy, a recovery team was organized. If there was any possibility that an American soldier was still in the jungle, Moore assumed that soldier was alive until proven otherwise. This was not standard procedure in Vietnam. Many units accepted that soldiers killed in areas controlled by the enemy would be recovered later, after the battle. After the tactical situation stabilized, the priority was the living. The dead could wait. Moore rejected this priority. He believed that leaving dead soldiers on the battlefield sent a message to the living soldiers that they were expendable, that if they died, they might be left behind, that the promise to bring everyone home was conditional, based on convenience and tactical considerations. By refusing to leave anyone behind, Moore was reinforcing the promise he had made before deployment. He was proving that the promise was absolute, that it applied in the worst possible tactical situation, that even when recovering bodies meant risking more casualties, the recovery would happen. This created a psychological contract that went beyond the words Moore had spoken in formation at Fort Benning. The soldiers of 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were watching their commander risk his life to recover dead soldiers. They understood that if they were killed, Moore would do the same for them. This understanding changed how they fought. Soldiers who believe they might be left behind have an incentive to avoid situations where they might be killed in an unrecoverable position. Soldiers who believe they will be recovered have an incentive to take risks that benefit the mission. The difference is tactical. A battalion that trusts its commander fights more aggressively than a battalion that does not. Part 5. The Last Man Standing. The final act of Moore's promise occurred on November 16th. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn. The battle was over. Reinforcements had arrived. The tactical situation at X-Ray was secure. The mission was to extract the battalion and move to the next objective. The extraction began with the wounded. Medevac helicopters landed and loaded the casualties. They flew to Pleiku, where field hospitals were waiting. The wounded were off the battlefield within hours. Next came the living unwounded. Rifle companies boarded helicopters by platoon. They were extracted to landing zone Falcon and then moved to other tactical positions. The extraction was efficient. Helicopters were landing and taking off continuously. Within hours, most of the battalion was gone. What remained were Moore, a small security element, and the dead. 79 American soldiers had been killed in action at landing zone X-Ray. Their bodies were scattered across the battlefield. Some were in the perimeter where they had fallen defending their positions. Others were outside the perimeter where they had died during assaults or patrols. The cut-off platoon had 9 dead. Moore supervised the recovery personally. He walked the battlefield with teams of soldiers who were searching for bodies. Every dead American was located, identified, placed in a body bag, carried to the landing zone, loaded onto a helicopter. This process took hours. The sun was setting. Moore was still on the ground. The security element was still on the ground. They were searching the areas outside the perimeter where soldiers had been killed during the fighting. They were making sure no one had been missed. By late afternoon on November 16th, every dead American soldier had been recovered except one. The last body was in an area that had been under enemy control. A search team went out. They found the soldier. They brought the body back. Moore waited while the body was loaded onto a helicopter. The helicopter took off. Moore watched it disappear toward Pleiku. He looked around the landing zone. Every living soldier from his battalion was gone. Every dead soldier from his battalion was gone. The only Americans left at X-Ray were Moore and the helicopter crew that was waiting to extract him. Moore walked to the helicopter. He was the last American to leave landing zone X-Ray, exactly as he had promised. First in, last out, no man left behind. The crew chief later reported that Moore did not speak during the flight to Falcon. He sat in the helicopter and stared out at the jungle. The battle was over. The promise was kept. But 79 of his soldiers were dead. The cost of keeping the promise was written in the body bags that had been loaded onto helicopters throughout the day. Part 6. The institutional impact of the promise. Moore's execution of his promise at Ia Drang had effects that extended far beyond his battalion. The story spread. Other units heard about it. Junior officers saw that a commander could make an absolute promise and keep it even in the worst tactical situation imaginable. Soldiers understood that the promise was not just words. The institutional culture of the United States military in 1965 was struggling with how to fight in Vietnam. The command from the air philosophy was becoming standard. Commanders were becoming managers. The distance between the generals making decisions and the soldiers executing those decisions was growing. Moore's example challenged that culture. He proved that physical presence mattered, that shared risk created trust, that trust created combat effectiveness. A battalion that believed its commander would die before abandoning them fought differently than a battalion that believed its commander would watch them die from a helicopter. The impact appears in the after-action reports and the lessons learned documents that followed Ia Drang. Multiple analyses noted that 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, held their perimeter against overwhelming numbers because of unit cohesion. The cohesion was attributed in part to Moore's leadership. The leadership was defined not just by tactical competence, but by the visible fulfillment of his promise to share their risk. This created a model for other commanders. If you want soldiers to fight when the situation seems hopeless, you need to establish trust before the battle begins. Trust is built through promises kept. Moore had kept his promise. His soldiers had fought. The lesson was documented. But there is a darker institutional impact that also needs to be acknowledged. Moore's promise was kept at X-Ray. But not every commander made that promise, and not every promise made was kept. There were battles in Vietnam where soldiers were left behind, where bodies were not recovered because the tactical situation made recovery too dangerous, where the promise that no man would be left behind turned out to be conditional. The soldiers who fought in those battles learned a different lesson. They learned that promises made by commanders are only as good as the commander's willingness to risk his own life to keep them. They learned that trust is fragile, that it can be destroyed by a single broken promise. And once trust is destroyed, it cannot be rebuilt. Moore understood this. He knew that his promise at Fort Benning had placed him in a position where he had no choice but to risk everything to keep it. If he had left soldiers behind at X-Ray, his credibility as a commander would have been destroyed. His soldiers would have known that his promise was rhetoric. They would have fought differently in future battles. The cohesion that held the perimeter at X-Ray would have disintegrated. This is the institutional lesson that extends beyond Vietnam. Command is not management. Leadership is not administration. Authority is not derived from rank. It is earned through promises kept, and promises in combat are absolute. There is no such thing as a conditional promise to soldiers who are being asked to die. Part 7. The Aura of the Last Man Out. There is an image from Landing Zone X-Ray that became iconic. It was not photographed. It exists only in the descriptions of the soldiers who saw it. The image is Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore standing alone in the clearing after every other American has been evacuated, waiting for the last helicopter, surrounded by the evidence of 3 days of fighting. This image became the visual representation of his promise. The last man out, standing alone in a place where hundreds had fought and died, refusing to leave until every single soldier, living and dead, had been accounted for. The image has power because it captures something fundamental about leadership. A leader who makes a promise and keeps it regardless of cost. A leader who shares the risk he asks others to accept. A leader who values his soldiers more than his own safety. This is not common in any military, in any war. Most commanders make promises they intend to keep. But when the tactical situation deteriorates and keeping the promise means accepting higher casualties, the promise is often abandoned. The excuse is that the mission comes first, that the living matter more than the dead. The tactical flexibility requires the ability to adjust commitments based on changing circumstances. Moore rejected all of these excuses. He had made a promise. The promise was absolute. The tactical situation at X-Ray was about as bad as a tactical situation can get. Surrounded, outnumbered, taking casualties, one platoon cut off. The promise was tested under the worst possible conditions. And Moore kept it. The aura of the last man out is the aura of a promise kept. It is the image of moral authority, earned through shared risk. It is proof that leadership is not about words. It is about actions taken when actions are difficult and dangerous. Soldiers remember this. They remember commanders who kept their promises and commanders who did not. The commanders who kept their promises earned loyalty that extended beyond the battlefield. The commanders who did not earned contempt that followed them for the rest of their careers. Moore earned loyalty. His soldiers would have followed him anywhere after X-Ray, not because he won the battle, because he kept his promise. They knew that if they fought under his command again, he would be first in and last out, that no matter what happened, he would bring them home or die trying. This is the aura that surrounds Moore's legacy, the last man standing in a clearing in Vietnam, waiting for the last helicopter, refusing to leave until every promise was kept. The image is powerful because it is true. And because it represents a standard of leadership that most commanders aspire to but few achieve. Part 8. The verdict. The promise that Hal Moore made to his battalion before deploying to Vietnam was not unique. Many commanders make similar promises. The promise to lead from the front. The promise to share the soldiers' risks. The promise to leave no man behind. These are standard elements of military leadership rhetoric. What made Moore's promise different was that he kept it. Under conditions where most commanders would have found excuses to break it. When keeping the promise meant risking his own life repeatedly. When keeping the promise meant staying on a battlefield for hours after the tactical mission was complete to supervise the recovery of dead soldiers. The test of a promise is not whether it is kept when keeping it is easy. The test is whether it is kept when keeping it is hard, when the cost is high, when the tactical situation would justify abandoning the commitment. When staying means accepting risks that could be avoided by leaving. Moore's promise was tested at Ia Drang. He was surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered his battalion 5-1. He had one platoon cut off in enemy-controlled terrain. He had casualties mounting every hour. He could have abandoned the cut-off platoon. He could have left dead soldiers on the battlefield for later recovery. He could have evacuated himself when headquarters offered him the opportunity. He did none of these things. He led the rescue force that reached the cut-off platoon. He supervised the recovery of every dead soldier. He refused to leave the battlefield until every American was accounted for. He was the last man to board the last helicopter. This is what promises look like when they are kept. Not words spoken in a formation at Fort Benning. Actions taken in a jungle clearing in Vietnam when soldiers are dying and the outcome is uncertain. Actions that prove the promise was not rhetoric. The institutional impact of Moore's promise extends beyond his battalion. It created a standard, a model of what command looks like when the commander values his soldiers more than his own career or safety. That model influenced a generation of officers who served in Vietnam and later rose to senior leadership positions. Some of them replicated Moore's example. They made promises to their soldiers and kept them. They led from the front. They shared the risks. They refused to leave anyone behind. These commanders built units with high trust and high combat effectiveness. Others did not replicate the example. They made promises but broke them when keeping them became inconvenient. They commanded from helicopters or headquarters. They prioritized their own safety over their soldiers' needs. These commanders built units with low trust and poor cohesion. The difference between the two types of commanders was not tactical competence. Both types could read maps and coordinate fire support. The difference was moral courage, the willingness to accept risk to keep a promise. The understanding that soldiers who trust their commander fight harder than soldiers who do not. Moore understood this. He built his command philosophy around it. The promise he made at Fort Benning was the foundation of everything that followed. The training, the deployment, the battle at Ia Drang, the rescue of the cut-off platoon, the recovery of every dead soldier, the last man out. By the time Moore boarded that final helicopter on November 16th, he had proven that his promise was not just words, it was a binding contract, and he had paid the cost of keeping the contract in full. 79 of his soldiers were dead, 121 were wounded, but every single one had been accounted for. Every living soldier evacuated, every dead soldier recovered. The promise was kept. This is the verdict on Moore's leadership at Ia Drang. He made a promise that seemed impossible to keep. He kept it anyway. He proved that leadership is not about words or rank or position. It is about promises kept when keeping them requires everything a man has to give. The image of Moore standing alone in that clearing, waiting for the last helicopter, is the image of that promise kept. It is the aura of moral authority earned through actions rather than words. It is proof that some commanders mean what they say, and that soldiers will follow those commanders into hell if they believe the commander will bring them out again. If your father or grandfather served with Hal Moore at Ia Drang, I want to hear about it in the comments. What did he tell you about those days at X-Ray? What stories did he share about Moore's leadership? The official histories record the casualties and the tactical outcome. The comments record what it felt like to fight under a commander who kept his promises. Those details matter. Write them down. They deserve to be preserved.